Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. My last video, surprisingly to be honest, seems to have ruffled a few feathers. I'm not sure why, since I simply based my observations about Chopin's Prelude in E major, Opus 28 number 9, on the alignment of values we see in the manuscript. I assumed that anyone would agree that if Chopin aligned the 16th note vertically with the third note of the triplet, then that 16th should be played together as a chord with the notes below. Apparently, that assumption was unwarranted. As it turned out, I probably wasn't sophisticated enough in my explanation for some viewers, who promptly commented with a range of rather curious remarks. I admit that there's more nuance to the issue of alignment, meaning that it's not that a 16th note always aligns with the third note of a triplet. But when a composer goes out of their way to indicate such an alignment, and in Chopin's music we can find many cases of deliberate alignments in the manuscripts he prepared for his publishers, then it's safe to assume that aligning is the right thing to do. I don't see much nuance in the clear and orderly way of organizing notation, even when the math doesn't math. As I explained in the video, Chopin never used the quarter-eighth notation to show an alignment within a triplet. There is one case in the Prelude in C major, Opus 28, number 1, in which he does use the 8th-16th figuration as a triplet, and we'll get to that later in this video to explain why this isolated instance was used. But let's proceed with order. My intention in my previous video was simply to outline how Chopin notated the Prelude in E major and how some performers choose to align while others do not. Does not aligning make an interpretation bad? Not at all. In fact, there are wonderful readings of the Prelude that feature misalignments. One of my favorite historical recordings of the piece is Alfred Cortot's, in which he misaligns every single 16th note. However, the argument is quite nuanced, and I believe Cortot played it that way because he was using a score in which the alignment is not observed. We have a wealth of information about this specific alignment, not only in the manuscript, which we can view online or in a facsimile version. Several recent critical editions make it clear how Chopin notated it. In the accompanying commentary to those editions, one can find explanations of the differences between the sources, the autograph manuscript, copies, first editions, etc., and of how those details were transmitted in later printings. So, to me, not being curious about why an alignment is proposed in print, or not consulting what the commentary at the back of the score tells us, is unfortunate and reveals a certain laziness, carelessness even. Some might object that what truly matters is interpretation, how the music takes shape in performance. Of course, that's important. But the idea that a performer who spends countless hours studying every aspect of a work would completely ignore the historical context that informs its notation seems worse to me. Or worse still, if they consult the manuscript, see what Chopin wrote, understand the notation, and choose to ignore it, it's as if they had been mispronouncing someone's name. The person told them the correct pronunciation, and then they insisted on saying it wrong because they liked it better. And believe me, living in the United States with a name like Roberto, I know what that means. Of course, there may be cases in which a dotted figure doesn't align with a triplet underneath, and that's okay. The fact that a 16th note at the end of a beat can be assimilated and aligned with the third note of a triplet, particularly when rubato is involved in melodic playing, doesn't necessarily warrant an alignment. In the course of shaping a phrase, that third part of the beat might be placed slightly later, generating a natural misalignment. But that's not the point of this video. Or better, I'd love to have that conversation, but not before disentangling all this. In my previous video, I was referring exclusively to what we see in Chopin's own manuscript of the Prelude, and peripherally to the alignments on the final page of the Polonaise Fantasy. I mentioned that this is a common phenomenon in Chopin's writing, as we encounter this type of notation rather frequently. What we see in Chopin's manuscript seems quite clear to me, as I mentioned. I find it perplexing that someone would object to the alignment after seeing how Chopin actually notated the Prelude. Yet some of my viewers did. There could be two reasons for this. First, that's not how people play it, and not what I'm used to. Therefore, the alignment cannot represent what Chopin intended. As I mentioned in my previous video, interpretive traditions inherited from late 19th and early 20th century editions were often based on engraving conventions rather than on the composer's intention. These traditions became so ingrained in the way we hear this music that when we encounter something different, it may feel disorienting. I'm quite sure that if the situation were reversed, where the common way of playing the Chopin Prelude were by aligning, for example, if someone suddenly misaligned, we would probably feel equally disoriented. Second, the resistance may come from the fact that quarter-eighth figurations were used by other composers in Chopin's time or earlier, even if on very rare occasions. When I researched this issue about 25 years ago, I could find only two examples. Schubert's Lied Geisternähe, D-100 from 1814, and the final scene from Bellini's Norma from 1831. So they're clearly rare. Why rare? Because in both Schubert's Lied and in Bellini's Norma, the coexistence of the quarter-eighth and dotted-eighth 16th figures within the same passage served exclusively to distinguish two rhythmic functions that otherwise could be confused. Here is how Schubert makes the distinction in his Lied. The dotted figures and the quarter note, eighth note figures. And here is an excerpt of the scene from Norma as notated by Bellini himself in his full score of the opera. Let's focus on Schubert's Lied and have a brief analysis of the notation. Schubert may have been compelled to use both figures in Geisternähe precisely to clarify that one rhythm should align and the other shouldn't. It seems reasonable that a composer might worry that a performer would not be able to understand the distinction unless a clearly contrasting notation was used. But this rare occurrence does not exclude the possibility that elsewhere dotted figures would be used to represent a 2+1 ratio within the same composer's output and, of course, in the works of other composers. We shouldn't assume that a dotted eighth 16th note figuration should always misalign against a triplet simply because another notational formula for the same exists. There are too many deliberate alignments in Schubert's manuscripts to claim that they shouldn't align merely because at a point in the year 1814, Schubert used a quarter-eighth figure once, and that therefore every dotted eighth 16th note figure written by any composer after 1814 should never align. That's not how notation works. Each composer may have had their own system, and even within a composer's life, that system could have changed over the years according to new habits or newly introduced notation. Furthermore, the same people who insist on the misalignment because of mathematical proportions between values will then accept that the 16th note be placed as the second part of the last note of the triplet, which would make it 1/6 of the beat and not 1/4. But if that flexibility is accepted, if they are okay with stretching the value of the dotted note to 1/5 of a beat, why would it be so complicated to compress its value to something smaller? There's another important issue. We don't actually know what playing a dotted figure meant in the first part of the 19th century. We tend to interpret these rhythmic notations as 21st century musicians, expecting that performers 200 years ago heard and played rhythm as we do. But I don't think that that's the correct approach. The perception of what constitutes the execution of a dotted figure is probably much more defined today than it was 200 years ago, for reasons that go from the way we measure and keep time to the advances in technology, which give us very different perspectives compared to anyone who lived in the first half of the 19th century. Take the opening of the Impromptu in C minor by Schubert. The dotted figure dominates, and its march-like character might make one think that the rhythm should remain strictly dotted when it appears later against triplets, simply because that's how the piece begins. But I suspect that in 1827, when the Impromptu was published, the opening would have been played under-dotted, that is, with a triplety feel, and that perhaps it should assume a different, more pointed character later when it appears against quadruplet. In fact, when it appears in triplets later on, to me the alignments in Schubert's hand are unmistakable. Still, should we insist that a theme must appear with exactly the same rhythmic character throughout a piece just because we perceive it that way in the opening section of the piece? This leads to another very interesting question. Both Chopin and Schubert could have used 12/8 as the time signature for the Prelude in E major or for Geisternähe. Why didn't they? I can only speculate, of course, but try reading Chopin's Prelude in 12/8. You might find what you see slightly annoying to read, especially in 1840 when the Preludes were published. In fact, in my first book, The Secret Life of Musical Notation, I made the effort to transcribe the Prelude into 12/8 to show that the result would have featured a large number of tide values to represent the 30 seconds. Not only are the ties inelegant and inconvenient to read, they also challenge the reader with having to distinguish dotted and non-dotted quarters alongside the large number of ties across beats and bars. Chopin, like every composer of his era, I assume, cared deeply about how his music looked in print and how easily it could be read. And if the Prelude is a march, as Vincent Ong himself mentioned in his comment on my previous video, have you ever seen a march notated in 12/8? Please let me know in the comments section if you have, because I've never seen one. Now, about Schubert's Geisternähe, why did he write it in cut time, 2/2, rather than in 12/8 or 12/16? Well, 12/16 would have been quite an unusual time signature to use, but the reasoning is essentially the same as Chopin's. The issue of having to switch between quarters and dotted quarters for both singer and pianist, and to avoid excessive ties. We can't forget that the market for this music was primarily that of amateur musicians who may have been annoyed by the idea of reading overcrowded scores. But in the case of Schubert's Lied, however, there's an additional complication. Two rhythmic elements that were uncommon in early 19th century notation. Were the Lied written in 12/8, the frequent pairs of eighth notes would appear against a compound meter as irregular groups, duplets. And sometimes, out of necessity, the first note of these duplets would have to be tied to the previous beat to represent a dotted quarter note. The second uncommon rhythmic element that would have emerged is the quadruplet of 16th notes, even though Schubert uses it only once in the Lied. As an irregular group, it was still unusual in compound meters at the time. Both irregular groups might look rather normal to us more than 200 years later, but they were avoided in the early 19th century and were still foreign to the average music reader. By choosing a regular meter such as 4/4 or cut time, Schubert avoided all these notational problems. The use of frequent duplets, sometimes tied to a previous value, and the quadruplet. In exchange, he only had to address the disambiguation of figures that aligned with, or misaligned against, the triplets of the piano part. So the only unconventional solution he used was the quarter-eighth figure instead of two unusual irregular figures, the duplet and the quadruplet. In the process, he also avoided the enormous number of ties and the potential confusion created by the presence of simple and dotted quarters. I realized this was a lot of words to say very little in the end. It's a lot of information to take in, and I hope it wasn't confusing. Now, let's discuss the 30-second notes in Chopin's Prelude number 9. In my previous video, I suggested that they should be played as the second half of the third note of the triplet, and I demonstrated this with a recording I made on my own piano just minutes before publishing the video. My rendition was deliberately square and devoid of inflection, simply to make a point. Some misunderstood it as advocating a kind of rigid rhythmic exactness, which was never my intention. For those who don't know me personally, in music circles I'm sometimes called not Roberto Poli, but Rubato Poli. So, of course, I would never play strictly. It actually took quite a bit of restraint to play that squarely. So, please, if you decide to play the prelude as I suggested, which is what I believe Chopin rhythmically intended, give those 30 seconds all the inflection they deserve. Overdot them, underdot them. Reduce them to smaller values when appropriate. Vary them expressively to highlight the extraordinary harmonic turns that Chopin unfolds before us. But please don't ignore those alignments in the soprano line.